Welcome to the deep dive. We take reading you suggested and, well, we dive deep, pulling out the key ideas.
Yep.
And this time, we're tackling a really fundamental question. What does the Bible actually mean by nations when it talks about Christian mission?
Our source for this is a chapter from the book Imara, Gospel-Centered Mission to Muslims.
And our mission for this deep dive.
It's really to understand this idea of nations not as countries, but as people groups, especially in the context of mission strategy.
Right. The chapter kicks off with this scenario. It really sets the stage. There's a Kenyan woman, Mary, wants to be a gospel worker in Mauritania.
Yeah, from Nairobi.
Exactly. But her pastor asks, shouldn't we focus on the needs right here in Nairobi first before going to, a totally different people group?
Which leads straight to the big question the chapter poses.
Does it really matter who we reach? Is reaching someone in Nairobi the same, missionally speaking, as reaching someone in Mauritania? Let's unpack that.
Okay, so that starting point immediately highlights this crucial distinction. The word the Bible uses, particularly the New Testament, for nations, is the Greek word ethnos.
Ethnos, okay.
And the book stresses, this is important, it doesn't mean modern political countries, not the United Nations, not even the nation of Kenya in a political sense.
So it's not about borders on a map. It's more cultural, ethnic.
Exactly. It's about ethnic groups or maybe tribes, people groups, sharing a common history, language, culture, that kind of thing.
Okay. So it's a much richer, more specific idea than just country.
Definitely. And understanding that really changes how we read something like Jesus' Great Commission in Matthew 28.
Right. Go and make disciples of all nations.
Of all ethnos. So all these distinct people groups. And the book points out that when Jesus says, I am with you always to the end of the age, that implies this command isn't just for those first apostles. It's for, all followers of Christ, right up until he returns.
So it's a universal calling for the church, not just for, specialist missionaries?
Precisely. It's for everyone.
Okay, so the what is make disciples. The who or where is all ethnos. How does the chapter break down the how?
Well, the passage mentions going, making disciples, baptizing, and teaching. But the source highlights something interesting about the Greek grammar.
Oh, yeah.
Make disciples is the main command, the imperative verb. The others going, baptizing, teaching, they sort of describe how we make disciples.
Got it. So making disciples is the core action. And what's a disciple again?
Fundamentally, a learner. Someone following Jesus, learning his ways, like in Matthew 4, follow me and I will make you fishers of men.
A learner, an apprentice almost.
Yeah, exactly. So the goal is learners of Jesus in all these ethnos, these tribes or people groups.
Okay, so that's the New Testament picture. But you mentioned this isn't entirely new.
Not at all. The book argues the foundation is laid way back in the Old Testament. Think Genesis 12.
God's call to Abram.
Exactly. God tells him to leave his people, promises to make him a great nation, and then says this is key, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
All the families. Okay, so not just individuals.
Right. And that promise gets repeated multiple times in Genesis.
Yeah.
Now, the Hebrew word for families isn't identical to ethnos, but the point the book makes is that God's focus is already on these groups, these collections of people.
Interesting.
And the blessing, ultimately, comes through Jesus, the seed of Abraham. And it's meant for all these groups. It's not just an Israel-centric plan.
So even way back then, God had this global scope in mind, focused on blessing distinct groups of people.
That's the argument. And the Old Testament is full of this hope. The Psalms, Isaiah, chapter groups examples. You've got verses declaring God's glory among the nations, like Psalm 9.
Okay.
Promises that all nations will eventually worship him, like Psalm 45.
Right.
Prayers asking God to be praised among the peoples, like that famous Psalm 67.
May God be gracious to us and bless us.
I make his face shine upon us, that your ways may be known on earth, your saving power among all nations. Yeah, that one. And even personal statements, like in Psalm 18, where the psalmist plans to praise God among the nations.
So it's this consistent theme. Israel's blessing wasn't just for them.
Exactly. It was meant to overflow. Psalm 67 again. God blesses Israel so that his ways and salvation become known to all nations, all people groups. It connects the Old and New Testaments beautifully.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. Now, how did this play out in the early church? Paul is the obvious figure here.
Absolutely. The chapter argues Paul's whole missionary strategy was built on this understanding flowing from Jesus' command and rooted in the Old Testament vision.
Where do we see that clearly?
Acts 13 is a key moment. Paul and Barnabas are in the synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia. They preach, but face strong opposition from the Jewish leaders.
Okay, I remember this.
And they make this bold declaration. Okay, since you reject it, we now turn to the Gentiles. And they quote Isaiah 49.
The light for the Gentiles verse.
I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. Yep. And again, the book reminds us, Gentiles. Here, the Hebrew goyim also means nations, people groups.
So Paul wasn't just saying, okay, we'll talk to non-Jews now. He was saying, our focus shifts to reaching these other people groups.
Exactly. It's strategic. It's about establishing a gospel presence within those distinct groups. Galatians 3:8 is also mentioned, linking Paul's work directly back to the promise to Abraham that the nations would be blessed.
In Romans, Paul talks a lot about Gentiles there.
He does. Romans 15 is crucial. Paul says Christ came for two main reasons.
Yeah.
One, to confirm the promises God made to the patriarchs, like Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
And two, so that the Gentiles, the ethnos, again, might glorify God for his mercy. These aren't separate goals, they're interconnected. The promise was for the Gentiles too.
That makes sense. And how did this theology shape his actual, missionary methods?
Well, look at Romans 15 again, verses 18 to 21. Paul talks about his ambition. What was it?
To preach where Christ wasn't already known?
Right. Exactly. He didn't want to build on someone else's foundation. His focus was pioneering, reaching the unreached ethnos.
But then he says something that sounds kind of strange. He says he's basically finished his work from Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum.
Yeah, fulfilled the ministry of the gospel there.
And now he wants to go to Spain. That area wasn't fully Christian, surely.
Right. It seems contradictory if you think he meant reaching every single person.
Yeah.
But the chapter suggests Paul's goal was different. It was likely about establishing a viable, witnessing church within the major people groups of a region.
Ah.
So you've done that from Jerusalem to Illyricum. Rome already had a church, even if he hadn't planted it. So where next?
Spain, a place presumably without that established witness among its people groups.
That seems to be the logic. And it fits with him leaving people like Timothy in Ephesus or Titus in Crete.
To continue the work within those specific groups.
Yeah, to build up the churches, further evangelize within that ethnos. Paul laid the foundation, others built on it.
Okay, that clarifies his movements. It wasn't random wandering. It was strategic, people group focused.
And the chapter makes this really punchy statement here. Paul's theology influenced his methodology. Bad theology will always produce bad missionaries or no missionaries at all.
Wow. That's direct. So our understanding of the mission really dictates how or even if we engage with it.
It seems so. Theology matters.
Okay, so we've seen the biblical basis, Old Testament roots, Paul's example. How does this connect to the future, the end times?
The chapter links it directly. First, it clarifies that reaching all people groups is a task for the whole church. Not everyone goes physically, but everyone participates. Mobilizing, praying, sending, supporting financially. Like Paul mentions in Romans 15 about the Roman church helping him get to Spain, or the Philippians supporting him.
It's a collective effort.
Yes. And then Matthew 24:14 comes up again. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, all ethnos, and then the end will come.
So reaching all people groups is somehow tied to Jesus' return.
It's presented as a key sign. And the ultimate fulfillment, the book argues, is seen in Revelation.
The vision of heaven.
Yeah, Revelation 5. John sees redeemed people gathered before the throne. And where are they from?
From every tribe and language and people and nation.
Exactly. Every ethnos. That's the end game. That's the climax of God's redemptive plan. A worshiping community made up of people from every single group.
That's a powerful image. The chapter quotes John Piper here, right?
It does. It's a famous quote. Missions is not the ultimate goal of the church. Worship is. Missions exist because worship doesn't.
Wow.
When this age is over, missions will be no more. It is a temporary necessity. But worship abides forever.
So mission is the means to the ultimate end, which is universal worship from every people group.
That's the perspective. It reframes why we do missions. We're working towards that Revelation 5 reality.
The book also connects this to Caiaphas' prophecy in John's Gospel.
Yeah, unexpectedly, Caiaphas prophesied that Jesus would die not just for Israel, but to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad.
Scattered among the nations, the ethnos.
Precisely. It connects Jesus' death directly to gathering people from all groups, foreshadowing that Revelation 5 scene.
And this whole idea underscores Paul's point in Romans 10, doesn't it? People can't believe unless they hear, and they can't hear unless someone is sent to preach.
Absolutely. If God's plan includes people from every ethnos, then someone needs to go to every ethnos with the message.
But the promise in Revelation is comforting, isn't it? It guarantees that people from every group will be saved.
Yes, Revelation assures us the mission won't ultimately fail. God will gather his people from every tribe, language, people, and nation.
Okay, this brings us to the present day. And as the chapter points out, this might be surprising for listeners, especially in places with lots of churches.
That there are still entire people groups with essentially no Christian presence at all.
Right, which leads to these terms, reached and unreached. How does the book define a people group today? Is it simple?
Not really. It admits definitions vary. Some focus mainly on language, others on ethnicity, religion, caste, culture, or some combination.
So the total number of groups isn't fixed?
No. Estimates range maybe from around 11,000 up to 24,000. The Joshua Project, which the book references, uses a mix of ethnicity, religion, caste, culture, and comes up with about 17,400 groups.
Okay. Quite a few. And how do we know when one is reached? Is there a clear line?
That's also complex. Paul's example of moving on suggests a point where a foundation is laid. The chapter infers some minimal criteria might be the gospel has been preached effectively. Some people have believed. A local church has formed.
Okay.
And crucially, that church has the capacity, people, resources to continue evangelizing its own people group without needing constant outside help. It can reproduce itself.
Right, self-sustaining.
Yeah.
So based on that, what's an unreached people group, or UPG?
The Joshua Project definition is commonly used. It's a group where there isn't a large enough indigenous community of believers and resources to evangelize their own group. The numbers often cited are less than 2% evangelical Christian and less than 5% professing Christian overall.
And are there many UPGs?
Thousands, representing billions of people. It's a huge part of the world's population.
And unreached doesn't just mean they haven't heard the name Jesus, right?
No, crucially, it means they lack access. They don't have neighbors, family, colleagues who are Christians. There aren't churches readily available, maybe no Bible in their language. The book mentions this statistic, something like 86% of Muslims worldwide don't personally know a Christian. That's a lack of access.
Wow. The example given is Japan.
Yeah, a country many people know. It has Christians, missionaries work there, but by these definitions, the Japanese people group as a whole is considered largely unreached. There isn't that indigenous reproducing church movement across the whole population.
Okay, UPG. Then there's another term, FPG.
Right, frontier people group. This might be an even sharper focus, perhaps closer to what Paul was targeting.
How is an FPG different?
It's an UPG, but with virtually no Christian presence at all. The threshold is usually less than 0.1% Christian adherence. Basically, no known believers, no church movement started, nada.
Less than 0.1%, that's tiny.
It is. And there are nearly 5,000 FPGs identified. They represent over 2 billion people, maybe a quarter of the world's population.
2 billion people in groups with almost zero chance of hearing about Jesus from someone within their own group.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The odds are incredibly slim without outside cross-cultural workers coming in.
That leads to a really stark statistic the chapter presents about missionary distribution.
Yeah, this one is sobering. Globally, something like 96% of cross-cultural missionaries are working among already reached people groups.
96%. So where are the rest?
Only about 3% are working among the broader category of unreached people groups.
And the FPGs, the ones with almost no access.
Just 1%. 1% of the missionary force focused on that quarter of the world's population who are part of frontier people groups.
Wow. That really puts Paul's words from Romans 10 into perspective. How will they hear without someone preaching? How will they preach unless they are sent?
It really does. The need for workers focused on those least reached, least access groups is just immense based on these figures.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The big takeaway from this deep dive seems to be this consistent biblical focus from Genesis right through to Revelation on God's heart for distinct people groups, the ethnos, not just individuals scattered randomly.
Yes, reaching them with the gospel is central to the mission Jesus gave.
And today, the reality is stark. There are thousands of these groups, particularly frontier people groups, billions of people who still have virtually no access to that message within their own communities.
That lack of access is the critical issue.
Which leads us, and leaves you listening, with a really significant thought to wrestle with, doesn't it?
I think so.
Given this biblical emphasis on ethnos, and seeing the huge imbalance in where missionary efforts are currently focused, where does your own understanding of the Great Commission fit in? how much weight do you give to the idea of prioritizing those with the least access?
Yeah, what does that mean for how you pray, how you give, how you think about global mission, maybe even how you consider your own life?
It's definitely something to reflect on. Thanks for digging into this with us.
Glad to. It's important stuff.